for joining us today for another session of EI Live K-12, where we have Joshua DeVincenzo, from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, who's going to talk to us about climate change conversations and facilitating different types of climate change conversations, as these conversations are sometimes difficult to have. So as if you are joining us for the first time today, welcome. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Climate School, we are the first school at Columbia University in 25 years. And we're very excited to be the school and to have set up the school. The school encompasses the Earth Institute, which is made up of over 700 or so research faculty and staff who are committed to addressing issues of climate change from both the physical sciences and the social sciences. So what we hope to do with these EI Live K-12 sessions is to introduce you to some of that content and the research that our wonderful researchers and faculties and staff work on, and really give you an opportunity to ask questions about their work and the conversations they're having within their communities. So we, as I mentioned, we have Josh today here, and the session is being recorded, and we'll share a copy with everybody at the end, and it'll also get posted to our to the Earth Institute EI Live K-12 site. And if you do have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A box so that we can monitor the questions. You won't be able to use the chat box, and we're not using the raise hand function today. So Josh, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Cassie. And it's good to be back to EI Live K-12. It's been just an excellent opportunity to participate in these different talks over the past few years. And this talk especially seems to be quite popular in the sense of an urgency to practice, to really look at how we are taking research or policy or practice and bringing it to different groups of people. And this conversation this afternoon is going to be kind of a combination of some of my own experiences working around climate issues across different stakeholders, as well as some practice for everybody. So it's intended to be interactive. If folks are watching a recording of this lecture at a later date, feel free to pause the recording at any point and think through some of the exercises here, but we will lay down some context. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and especially to the students and educators still navigating the otherwise complex conditions of schooling today. And I hope that this lecture helps to just expand some horizons and is in somewhat, in one sense, interesting to you and applicable. This will definitely be one of the more applied conversations of hoping to give everybody a toolkit to take into whatever context you're working under, whether you're still learning about climate change or whether you're exploring different colleges or different workforce options around climate change. This talk hopefully will have something for you here. And to the teachers and the educators, these are some exercises that you can replicate into your classrooms just to go further than just talking about how difficult it is to talk about climate change, but then really look at some different strategies in which we can do this effectively. So looking forward to diving in here today. Going to move my screen. So I kind of briefly touched on what the agenda is, and I want to maximize our time that we have together. This is just the beginning of many conversations, as we'll see, that we need to have around how to effectively engage different communities around climate change. And today's perspectives are really about looking at our own assumptions. What are we assuming about maybe another person that might be labeled as a climate denier or a climate skeptic? And what can we learn from their perspectives as well in framing our conversation, our discussion? So we want to understand the variety of perspectives that are out there. Trust me, there's plenty. And of course, we can't kind of go through every single perspective, but we will look at some in a pretty low risk environment. And I really want to drive that point home that today we'll have a unique opportunity to practice with very low stakes. Whereas we know these conversations around climate change and what to do about climate action tend to be more difficult. And I think it does take a lot of practice, and it's never, accomplished in one discussion. I think we need to look at this as really the human to human relationship and how we're communicating, how we're learning from each other. So even for this talk, I usually try to refrain from using climate denialism and use a more softer coat of skepticism, in the sense that, we're all really learning together. And I don't really want to label groups of people that might have different perspectives. And that's going to be kind of a key tenet to how we approach our discussions, and hopefully have more effective conversations. To do this, we'll have a toolkit. So we're not going to just be talking about talking. We're going to look at, different approaches from conflict resolution and negotiation that we can apply to the climate context to make our conversations a little bit more fruitful, to learn with our peers and our communities around climate change. And then we'll open up for Q&A, but I really want to go through some of the context here before we actually practice, just so that we have an understanding of what kind of goes into our approaches. And before I do that, just a quick introduction here, just to frame also where I'm coming from my perspective. As we know, there's when it comes to climate change, climate research and practice, there are many perspectives out there. I work for this as a senior instructional designer for the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. So a lot of what my work is rooted in is how we communicate messaging, training, and education around preparedness around the country to climate related disasters, hazard identifications, things like that. So I'm more on the disaster side, and we'll look where there are many different perspectives and how they all kind of have synergies. I also work as an adjunct lecturer at the Columbia Climate School, where I get to work with graduate students, which is just another different audience in which I have to think through how do I communicate climate change. My own research has framed much of this. I'm a doctoral candidate at Columbia, specializing in adult learning and climate and cognitive science as it relates to climate change. So a lot of what I will pull into my perspective today is looking at one, the psychology, two, kind of the sociology of all these issues and how they interrelate. My background is actually in business and education policy, which also frame a lot of my perspective on climate communications. And then I always add this bullet point here because this is important in kind of putting some emphasis on my own environment that I grew up in. So I'm the son of a retired business person, but then also of an elementary school environmental sciences teacher. So I've had these perspectives shaping my ideas of how to communicate climate change to different stakeholders and groups for a very long time, and has really influenced how I approach my own climate learning. And for today, what we really want to look at is three major buckets. We're really looking at climate change literacy. So what is climate change, the nuts and bolts here. What does that look like in relation to individual biographies, one's own experience with climate change? And then what does that look like in a policy standpoint? Because at the end of the day, we are also observing what can and is being done around climate change and looking at that policy piece. But what becomes so difficult about climate communications is the fact that we have to look at the interplay of these three gears together. This leads to quite nuanced perspectives of climate change and our approaches in which we engage different people. So there isn't kind of a one size fits all approach to climate communications or climate learning for that matter. And we need to really account for these three gears, but of course there's additional gears to this. When they're all turning in sync, of course that it will complement, and that's kind of when learning and a space for conversation can really happen. Before I go into a lot more conversation around approaching these different discussions around climate change, it is really important for us to kind of share a definition. And the definition I'll be using is out of the IPCC. So when I refer to climate change, and this is also good practice for when you are engaging conversations around climate change, is just to start that discussion off with how you're defining climate change. Sometimes, in most cases, it might not have to be this technical definition, but making sure you're on the same page with everybody at the outset. So I'll be using the IPCC definition. Primarily this bolded sentence here at the bottom: a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So that is more or less to say, this is when I refer to climate change throughout this presentation, this is the definition I'll be using. It is, of course, not the only definition of climate change that is out there. So I want to start here with a very complex chart, a very complex visual here, and something that perplexes me, something that I have a very difficult time following. This is a map of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Oftentimes when it comes to climate communication, there is kind of more of a pessimistic stance that, you know, human capacity doesn't have all the tools to deal with the abstractions, the different nonlinear factions of climate change. And I always come back to this because I've heard some really diehard Marvel fans be able to unravel some of the most complex plot lines, overlaps, and all of that just visualized here. The human capacity is definitely there if applied with the right attention, if applied with something that's interesting. But if you took a look at this, this is very much so an analogy for the interdisciplinary approach that is required for climate change. So just like there's a Captain America, just like there is a Thor, Guardians of the Galaxies, we have all these different research groups out there that are looking at climate change, and all the plots intertwine and overlap and become one kind of larger story here. So this is just a fun way to kind of get us thinking of like what the human mind is able to kind of capture and follow if that interest and attention is there. And one of the challenges with climate communication is how do we keep people engaged? How do we loop in people across these plots? So in a less daunting, in my opinion, visual, we're going to actually look at what this looks like in the terms of climate change. So here is just one example of a climate change map where we're mapping out the different components. One thing when you're approaching climate change conversations that could be helpful for you is to think about your own orientation or what subset of climate change as a system, and really thinking of it as a system, is the conversation piece or the focal point. So for myself here, where you see all this being quite interrelated, much of where my research and my practice relies is here in the middle with the disasters, looking at floods, heat waves, droughts, fires, and looking at all these different connection points. Maybe that's not the focal point of my research, but knowing and being aware that it is part of this larger community. It's its own part of, I guess, a cinematic universe, if you will, a different movie. But when they all come together, that's, of course, you get the Avengers, right? So here is essentially a map of climate change and thinking of it through as a system. One advantageous aspect of thinking about it as a system opposed to just one sole thing, one object out there, is that there's a lot of different entry points now. So there's entry points in which we can engage others with conversation around climate change, whether it be more on the environmental health aspect, so looking at respiratory disease, things that could happen there, whether it's engaging people with conversations of loss of habitat, poverty, mass migration and displaced peoples, violence and conflicts, and weather patterns. So you can see in each of these buckets are opportunities to engage in conversation. So always looking at your own kind of climate orientation is helpful to get it started, and helpful to be a resource to others that are looking to engage and looking to learn more about what climate change is and what it means. So again, just going through the fact that a lot of my orientations on the disaster side, it has enabled a lot of opportunities to work across the country with different groups of people, from anywhere from kind of the local librarian to the local, state, federal government in that way, and thinking through what are these different perceptions of climate change. Uniquely with climate change conversations is that each of those conversations tend to have a different perspective or a different view. We'll talk about the different strategies and negotiation patterns that we can use depending on the stakeholder we're working with. But without a doubt, climate change and specifically these disasters have really come to the forefront and has pushed an urgency to be able to communicate climate change very effectively across different groups that need information quick, fast, and be able to link these different concepts together. So this is a lot of where my realm works. What this looks like in practical terms, working on the training and education side of disaster preparedness is, there's a lot of different settings that this occurs in. This occurs in, you can see here all the way on the right, this is a picture of Missouri to in the middle here is a emergency operations center in Florida. all the way to the left here is FEMA's headquarters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency headquarters. And the conversations around climate change in each of these different settings is going to be very different. So what we can do as climate communicators or engaging just people in conversation around climate change is as much homework as we can to really understand the needs of that given community, the priorities of that given community, but really important, the current understanding or conception of climate change in those communities as well. In addition to that, we have to look at multiple modalities. So some of my work is done in the classroom where you can see here, we're looking at engaging anybody from K through 12 settings to adults, to experts even on these topics, and being able to look at the information that we want to convey and we want to communicate and thinking through the setting appropriate ways to do so. Oftentimes this could even be our style. So I do want to point out just really quickly, written work, a lot of the work that gets circulated around climate could be done in a peer-reviewed fashion where it is going to be a very different writing style, communication style. And then to the right here, you can see more of an opinion article. And these are things that are very accessible in terms of the opinion articles or thought pieces for young people. And people are really interested in reading your perspective or what's going on in your community and thinking through how you're framing your lived experience and your way of navigating climate change in written form. So we might not get to the point where we are able to sit across from somebody or sit at a table to conduct a meeting, and we might have to turn to more of these op-ed type work where your opinion is going to be very valuable. What you're communicating is going to be very valuable, but it does take some practice in kind of framing your stance, framing what you'd like to communicate. So looking at across these different modalities, whether you're standing in front of a classroom or you're in a classroom as a student or you're writing up a piece on climate change, it is all very valuable if you do your homework in terms of what are some of the objectives, what is the current reality. And we'll talk about in a few moments why sometimes it's not always persuading people, right? When we're thinking about, are we trying to just convince somebody that's a climate denier or a climate skeptic that, this is happening? It's more, it's more complex than that. And there's different steps in which we need to take. The present moment is, as everybody is aware on this call or is listening to this recording, the present moment is a tough one when it comes to disasters, when it comes to climate, when it comes to pandemic. We see here that a lot of the terminologies that we're using and things that we need to be aware in climate communications might not hold true. That some of our prior models and definitions are being tested to its limits in the context of what we call in the disaster space compounding disasters. The idea that you can have a wildfire and a hurricane during a global pandemic where people are also being tasked to do social distancing and take precautions. So what we're seeing now more than ever is that climate communications and just communications around risk and disaster recovery has become incredibly important because people are seeking answers. So it's really pressed many practitioners and scholars to rethink how are we communicating. And it's really become more effective in the sense of approaching this as more of a human to human than expert to student type thing, where it's like we are shedding expertise and this is as close as we can get and more of, okay, we are all at the same time going through these experiences. How can we pick this apart? How can we better understand what your needs are? And how can we better address policies and programs in the future to address these? So it is a very interesting fact. If we had this talk 3 years ago around climate communications or even disaster communications, what we're seeing right now is there's brand new challenges and things that we're thinking through in our own approaches. So great timing for this conversation, but it is also a moment where we do need to think about many different perspectives that are out there, as we've seen in the past couple of years. One gauge that is always healthy to look at, this is the thing where we sometimes call the expert blind spot. Despite the fact that we're a climate school, we're previously an Earth Institute, we might be under the assumption that everybody's talking about climate change all the time. We would love that, that would be excellent and make our lives a lot easier and our work a lot more effective in that sense that people are picking it up and running with it. But we do have to hold ourselves kind of to an objective measure there. And one great communications program is the Yale program on climate communications that looks at this almost every year around, are people discussing global warming? is global warming being picked up in the media? And you can see here some of the data. The bottom line here, the lower line here is the media metric, where the top line here is discussing global warming amongst family members, peers, amongst friends. We'll understand in a few slides here why that's important. Those kind of very close-knit bonds, the family bonds for information exchange. But what you can see here is, these percentages are nowhere near like 3/4 or getting up there where we would assume, or we'd like to see people talking about climate change or the media coverage on climate change. Of course, all this is picking up a lot of good momentum. So by no means do I want to discount the momentum that has been made in this space, but this is kind of a reality check. This is a very important reality check that we need to be engaging in more of these conversations, that there needs to be more stories out there, that are reflecting that human experience. So who and how do we engage? This is just a quick framework around different stakeholders that are out there. We base a lot of our work at looking at the synergies of economic, social, and political groups, looking at the balance here. So the visual here is a little bit deceiving in the sense that these circles are somewhat evened out. Depending on a community that you're working for, or you're investigating at the local level, you can see these could be weighted much differently. But when we talk about economics, we're looking at, are we talking to people around climate change in chambers of commerce and economic development agencies, financial agencies, the nonprofits and faith-based groups, individuals? On the social side, as we just saw, is local media, national media picking up stories around climate change? Are nonprofits and faith groups engage in those conversations around climate change? And then, of course, individuals are there as well. A very important one is, are our political leaders at the local, state, federal levels, city managers, different agencies, do they have climate agendas? Are they looking to engage in, let's say, mitigation, for example? Are individuals voting for, disaster preparedness, disaster protocols there? So there's a lot of different stakeholders in which we are all very busy, in which knocking on the doors and calling them up. And this is just a good model of, when you're thinking about who am I talking to about climate change, seeing if you can categorize them into one of these different groups, because there will be very different approaches. But we'll come back to that and why having kind of an equal distribution across all these groups becomes very important for what we'd like to see in our communities. We can't talk about climate change communications or even discussions around climate change without addressing inequalities. This is something that we take out of a page from public health. So these are the social determinants of health. We see that the quality of our climate communications, the accessibility of our climate communications can also fall victim to many of these determinants as well that lead to inequalities. So when we talk about climate communications, we can have a really good campaign, we could have a really good course, or we could have a really good presentation or an op-ed that you're working on. But we need to make sure that we're accounting for the social environment. So looking at discrimination, looking at income, looking at education level, marital status, the physical environment. So are we taking into account place of residence, crowding conditions, built environments of building spaces, transportation systems? Language has become a very important one for us, where we think, and we've been working towards making sure our materials that we teach preparedness with are accessible in Spanish, or accessible for different types of needs from learners as well. Health services, so even just access, and taking into account all these things, because especially when we make recommendations, we have to be aware that all those recommendations or those programs may not be distributed equally. So this is just a really important thing to call out when we think about our communication strategies, and things to be prepared for as well. Because these are some of the most pressing social issues that are going to be part of an in-depth climate conversation. All that's to say, we're working towards community resilience. Really, why we're out here, we're trying to communicate climate change to as many people as possible, is because we want to get to a point where we get to an understanding of community resilience. This looks at a lot of those three circles that we just looked at, but in the sense that we want to see balance in economic development, in social capital being the networks that we have, the support systems that are in place, information and communication being the third pillar here, and probably one of the most important areas to address in the short term. Because that will lead to community confidence. So understanding the phenomena that is going around, and making people equipped to make decisions, to vote in certain ways, to be thinking about what it means for their communities in the face of climate impacts. This will, of course, lead to collective resilience. So to get to collective resilience, where we're looking at this at a more of a group level, we need to reduce the risk and resource inequities that we just talked about. We need to engage local people in mitigation. So these are the people that are in your town, talking through mitigation strategies, create organizational links. So even within, out of taking and removing the individual side of this, looking at the larger organizations, are they talking to each other about climate and how are they approaching that? Boosting social supports, and then being flexible, of course, being one of the most important elements here of resilience is the fact that we need to make many of these impacts less severe. And to do so, it takes all of these steps here, the economic development, the social capital, community confidence, and the whole list here. So all very important goals and things that we're all striving towards. So let's go back to the individual level, and we're going to start shifting gears to actually practice, because I think that was enough framing and theory and some of the applications that we've seen in the field for right now. Of course, like as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, this is just the start. These are things that I hope people can take away and continue their own research or their own practice on. But some of the common questions that we always kind of get when we try to approach climate engagement, climate communications is, one, why is it so difficult to understand? We looked at it in kind of a comical way of looking at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but that's not to discount the fact that these are complex issues. These are very complex topics. What do I need to know? So that's been a very common question that we receive is, how much do I really need to know? I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a XYZ. I'm not at the Columbia Climate School, so from the general public and at the community level, sometimes there is that kind of question that will come up of how much is necessary for me to really to know about these things. And that's something that we need to research even further. What can I do? So that is also, I'm sure folks have already engaged in these conversations. You've had this question asked you, what can I do about this? And one question that we also need to ask ourselves about who we're engaging with is, what assumptions do we have about what they think about climate change? And that's really going to be the main theme for the next 15 or so minutes of looking at assumptions and looking at what are our assumptions about them or the person we're engaging with that might be climate skeptical. What are their assumptions about us in terms of engaging in that conversation? And how do we reconcile the two? So that's going to be really the toolkit and what we're going to be practicing in a moment here. One way in which we can look at this, and this is just kind of a quick reference for you if you're new to having these difficult conversations around climate change, this is a very popular model from Carol Dweck looking at different mindsets. So she delineates two different mindsets as a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. But these fixed mindsets when it comes to climate are also tied to fixed ways of operating. So things that are kind of the status quo could lead and influence many of these fixed mindsets around climate. But when you're discussing climate change with somebody, you might want to think, is this person really kind of more on the growth mindset, or right now are they a fixed mindset? And I was in a session earlier this month talking about this, and someone said it best. They said, everybody around climate is fixed-ish, or like the people that we would call, climate skeptics are fixed-ish. And I think that's the best way to approach where we are in the present moment, that there is room to kind of move from the fixed mindset to the growth mindset, but we are kind of in this fixed-ish state. This is a little bit more definitions on this. The growth mindset is the belief that your basic qualities are things that you can cultivate throughout your efforts, strategies, and help from others. So you're really learning in many senses here. Where a fixed mindset is more of an urgency to prove yourself over and over. It's that belief that you have only a certain amount of intelligence, a certain personality, and a certain moral character. And that you have to kind of prove that over and over again. So the fixed mindset is not something in which you kind of give up on. It's something that you want to kind of cultivate, similar to the traits of the growth mindset. And people can be a combination of two things. And it could be subject matter, for example, with, let's say, soccer. Someone who really doesn't enjoy soccer could be very fixed mindset, but when you put them into a calculus class, they are heavily growth mindset. They want to know everything about calculus. So this isn't kind of you're set in stone one or the other, but it is helpful for us to understand what type of work we're going to have to put into these conversations around climate, because we don't want people to, be solidified as a climate denier or a climate skeptic. It's really everybody is becoming learners. Everyone's climate learner. But to engage with a climate learner requires time. It requires energy. It requires patience, but it also requires us to learn as well. And we're gonna take a look at that in a moment. The last note before we dive into some practice is just disinformation. So oftentimes we get really frustrated, that we can't seem to get this person or this group or this company on board with climate. And unfortunately, there's a lot of influences around the information that's shared. So going back to that Yale study, you can see that what we have in our social bonds, when a friend tells us something or a family member tells us something, we tend to run with that information. But the issue with technology, sometimes attributed to technology, is that information is just out there in such a surplus that there's very simple ways of manipulating information, manipulating charts that create a ripple effect in perception and a ripple effect in what we know around climate change or what others know at the community level. So this is something we always want to gauge and something that we want to listen for as well when we're engaging in these conversations. So we're going to get into some practice now. And this is really the applied segment of today's talk. And we're going to look at communication behaviors. This is going to be a very easy model to remember because it's AEIOU. This is a communications behavior model. It has 5 steps here, or 5 different types. And these are things that we want to be thinking about when we have a discussion with somebody. It could be a discussion about anything. It doesn't even have to be climate related. But thinking through, was that communication behavior more of an attack? Was it attacking? Was it evading? Was it more like, I don't really want to talk about this right now. Let's avoid this subject. Was it informing? Was it something in which both parties were mutually kind of sharing information, sharing opinions, sharing the sources of that information? 4, was it opening? Was it asking probing questions, asking questions to engage the learner, each other even more in that sense? Ultimately, was it uniting? Did you leave that conversation? And again, I guess it could be a conversation about anything, thinking about maybe what you talked about over lunch with whoever you had lunch with, or most recent lunch. Was it uniting? Did you leave that conversation on the same page or with a common understanding that, these are the actions that you would take on whatever it might have been? So these are the 5 kind of communication behaviors. We'll look at how to code them in a second. And for folks that are going to be participating in the activity coming up, this is a good slide to just kind of take a picture of. And because we're going to be using this to kind of code a quick narrative, but you can see examples of attacking. Are there threats? Are there hostile tones, criticisms? Is it stereotyping? Is it blaming? Is it constant interruption? Is it evading? Are we just ignoring? Are we changing the subject? Are we withdrawing? Evading, I will have to say, is a pretty common climate trend and communication behavior. Postponing or tabling the issue. Informing is some examples of giving rationale, making requests, sharing information, beyond information, sharing feelings, interests, concerns, hopes, and fears. Opening, as I mentioned before, is really that probing, asking questions, listening quietly, summarizing to show that you're listening. So, confirming what someone said, acknowledging. And then uniting, being one of the more difficult communication behaviors, is building rapport, highlighting common ground, reframing conflicts, proposing solutions, brainstorming, makes proposals to address needs. And you can see across multiple conversations, you might get a combination of these. You might, unfortunately, in some only get a certain category here. But it is something that we want to bring into awareness, because each time that you talk to someone or you have a difficult conversation around climate change, you learn more, and you learn more of what are some responses in which you can approach future conversations with. Sometimes, working in this space, it will take multiple conversations with the same individual or the same group to truly make an impact. So keep that in mind, and of course, be a little patient. As I mentioned before, we do pull a lot of this from negotiation and conflict resolution. And what we're looking at here is adopting more of an integrative negotiation style in our conversations around climate. This means that we're emphasizing common interests and common ground. It means that we're attempting to understand each other's interests, needs, and not solely their positions, and kind of categorizing again as, hey, climate skeptic, climate denier, but really looking at the interests and needs. That there's a free flow of relevant information, ideas, that we're looking for solutions and mutual gain. And the steps to do this is, first and foremost, identify and define the problem that you're hoping to discuss. Step 2 would be surfacing interests and needs. Step 3 would be generating alternative solutions. And step 4 would be evaluating and selecting those best alternatives. But again, this isn't necessarily to compete or to win something. This isn't competition. It's more of that cooperation piece that we're pulling for. And that's really the key tenet here of integrative negotiation style. So we're going to practice here with the last 20 minutes that we have. And what we're going to do is really look at and examine our own assumptions around a climate skeptic's point, their stance, and what we could do to further a conversation, even if it seems on the surface as one that we wouldn't want to engage in or we wouldn't want to continue. So what we're going to do is you'll hear from one climate skeptic in just a moment. We don't have a guest climate skeptic coming in. We didn't want to put anybody on the spot, and I don't want to put Cassie on the spot either to be kind of an unfavorable character, but I will do my best as a voice actor to be the climate skeptic. And then we're going to be looking at the narrative. We're going to pick apart what we're hearing. So one of the most important aspects of talking about climate change and engaging around climate change is, of course, listening, listening to where they're coming from, what are some of the sources of their information, what are their concerns and interests, and many of those integrative approaches that we just looked at. This may take multiple conversations, as I said before, but we're going to practice here today, and hopefully you'll continue to practice this in your own settings as well. So the purpose of this is really to surface our assumptions. And for folks that, and this is something that we take from qualitative research, where we're going to hear a narrative and we're going to kind of code it. But what we're looking at here from assumptions are just kind of rules of thumb that this climate skeptic is operating under. What are these things have to do with maybe power relationships, with the standard practices, the status quo, the fixed mindset attributes of where I guess it's a he because I'm going to be talking about it, he's coming from, and ideas, and then whether these assumptions are well-grounded. We're going to learn to look at these different viewpoints, because oftentimes when we're engaging and we almost just immediately hear, hey, I'm a climate denier, or hey, climate change isn't happening, or global warming. And it's gotten to the point in my career where my friends will do it just to see what my reaction is, because we are almost instantaneously putting on blinders at that point, but this is going to be really that low risk environment where we can kind of challenge ourselves to engage in that conversation, to think about the assumptions that are underlying it and pick it apart. So to do this, we're going to have a couple different roles, and you can see here at the bottom what the different roles will be. We'll have a storyteller, and for today's purposes, I'll be volunteering to be the storyteller, and I will tell the perspective and the frame of the climate skeptic. If your first name starts with the letters A through M, you will be a detective, and the detective are going to be really looking at those assumptions, listening for the assumptions that you hear, those rule of thumb, those status quo attributes. If your first name starts with the letters N through Z, you'll be a coder. So what you'll be doing is listening for the AEIOU behaviors and letting us know which ones you hear. We'll designate Cassie as the umpire. So if Cassie, you see anyone jumping to solutions in a few moments, we will kind of mark that as, or we'll flag that there, because we don't want to be jumping to solutions too soon. That's the idea of this, is really just looking at these conversation components. So again, and because this is a smaller group, or if you're at home listening to a recording of this, feel free to be either role. If you want to be a detective or a coder, feel free to do that. Or if you'd like to do both steps, that's also more than fine. But detectives, listening for assumptions; coders, using AEIOU behaviors to look at what goes on in this conversation. And then when we think about assumptions for detectives, this is just a quick hint. So you just want to list these assumptions. We'll look for a way to enter those in a few moments of what assumptions you hear. But when you're first listening to this narrative, just jotting down all the assumptions you hear, coders listening for the AEIOU assumption, AEIOU communication behaviors. And we'll go from there from a debrief. So to do this, to kind of get a little bit more interactivity here, we do have a link that we'll put in the chat box, but here's also a QR code. If you have your phone by you, feel free to kind of scan the QR code. If you're on your computer, either use the direct link, or you could also use these steps here. You'll go to www.menti.com. The code for this afternoon is going to be 2724-0460. Although the link in the chat box will be the most direct way to enter this other than the QR code. When I advance slides, you might see a pop-up if you're working from your phone that I have advanced slides. You just click that blue button and it will take you exactly to where we are. But this is going to allow you to add some input into the session in a few moments here after we hear from the skeptic. So I'll leave the screen up here for about 30 more seconds just for time's sake. So either it all goes to the same place, so no worries, either the QR code, the website on the left here, or the direct link in the chat. And I just put the direct link in the chat if you can see it. Perfect. And I got the sign from Cassie to wrap up pretty soon. So I'm going to move on here. And if you're not following along with Menti, no worries. Feel free to just kind of jot your ideas on paper. And it's more for the debrief that we'll have in a second. But we'll move on to the prompt. So I'm going to quickly read this. There are some hints here already bolded for some folks that are listening in or reading in of the narrative. And I'm going to do my best to be a climate skeptic for the next 10 seconds. And this is actually taken from an editorial, I believe. So this isn't necessarily made up, but these are things to, of course, to expect. So climate skeptic, let me put my climate skeptic voice on and face on. Okay, this is gonna be difficult for me. Okay, I don't agree that Earth's atmosphere is warming because of human activity. Instead, I think that natural factors such as sunspots or variation in the Earth's orbit are warming the atmosphere. These factors were addressed in a 2007 report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A large part of the American population openly challenges the theory of human-caused climatic change, not because we have been duped by big industry, nor because the media has failed to properly groom the message. Such notions are just naive and egotistical. They fail to consider the access to higher education that is available in this country and the plethora of information available from independent media. Informed American citizenry is at least moderately qualified to investigate many sides of an issue. So many questions, just so many few answers. So much talk about uncertainty and claims of impending doom allegedly awaiting our planet, whose history is filled with natural and unavoidable disasters over which man played no part. Okay, that was tough for me. I got to get out of character now, but let's take a second here. I'll leave it up here for a little bit more if you want to just take a quick glance before we hear from our different coders and detectives in a few moments here. Okay, excellent. Okay, so if you're on Menti, let's start here with this first prompt. What words stood out to you from the skeptic narrative? And feel free just to submit those in. Fail, yep. And feel free to post multiple words if you'd like. It all helps here with the output. Any others? We'll give it another second here. Okay, they're all coming in now. So there's a little bit of a delay. Disaster, fail, past, humans. Yep, good point. So a lot kind of sticks out from kind of this narrative here of what they're going through and what their kind of perspectives are here. So we are seeing kind of that human activity was very emphasized throughout the past, disasters. Yep, so excellent. We're going to go on to the next prompt here. So this is a little bit more complex here of looking at what assumptions did you hear? So what from that narrative were some assumptions you identified that would be important to call out here? So we'll give a couple seconds to type those in. Yep, I'm also following along in the Q&A. So if it is easier for folks to throw them in the Q&A, feel free to do so. I see that we have one response here around hidden assumptions of past disasters repeat in the future. So this really was a kind of a historical perspective here. I think the Earth is warming due to natural factors, really good. Past disasters are similar to current or future disasters. Whoever put that, the folks in the disaster world definitely appreciate that. So appreciate that response. Any other assumptions that folks heard from our climate skeptic? Excellent. I'm just looking in the chat box as well. And we'll go to the next step here. What different communication behaviors did folks hear? Did people hear attacking, evading, information, opening, any uniting that went on in that quick narrative? Okay, see one attack. Yep. I think there was a couple attacking words in there for sure. Yep, Ro, thank you. Egotistical was one that definitely stands out there. Good assumption for that. We'll come back to in a few moments here. Any other communication behaviors that folks saw? 2 for attacking, yep. And I'd put the egotistical comment also in attacking there. So we didn't really see it from that conversation, a lot of attacking. We see evading. We didn't really see a lot of informing or opening or uniting. These are things as communicators that we'd want to approach and ask further questions. So if we see that, for example, this climate skeptic is taking a primarily attacking stance, what we could do is open it up. So we could be the opening. We could look at some questions of asking around. One of the things that we didn't call out was that 2007 reference, and looking at, the fact that it's a little bit of an older report that we would want to, of course, share with this individual. Some of the more recent reports that have come out of the IPCC. Evading, yep. So it was kind of like, I don't really want to talk about this, but in very much so an attacking way. But that leaves these 3 categories really for us. This is an excellent visual that kind of helps us to see what our value is and our approach. If we have the stamina, we have the patience, and we have kind of the social and emotional intelligence to work with this person of doing the opening, doing the uniting, and informing. And this is where we would actually go back to that coding table and think through the different approaches in each of these that we could take. So thank you, everybody, for going through the AEIOU, to our coders and our detectives. Great feedback here. So these are, again, just an exercise that we could do with either a discussion. We can also do this with written work. So if you do see an article out there that might be on the more skeptical side around climate change, we can do these 2 exercises in terms of coding, listing out assumptions, to look at what assumptions have been confirmed, what's been challenged around what we might have assumed about a climate skeptic, what they're assuming about us. You can see one of the assumptions about us was clearly that we might be egotistical, or that the science community might be egotistical, that there were a lot of things in that attacking category that seemed present for some assumptions that might need to be checked. Which assumptions could not be checked. And then what we really want to be thinking about is how can we now flip that dynamic around informing, opening, and what's left with the AEIOU categories, especially if attacking seems to be the prominent one. A little help here. So this is skepticalscience.com. This is a QR code for it. This is just a excellent resource. Of course, it's going to take more than listing out a rebuttal that is just scientifically based. It is going to be a lot of these conversation components that we talked about today. But this is an excellent resource to get us started. These list out hundreds of common climate criticisms or critiques, and offers up some different discussion points as well as rebuttals for that. So it's kind of a nice pocket guide and toolkit for you if this is something that you see yourself engaging with down the road quite a bit. And then ultimately, we are looking at this climate change aspect along with individual biographies, understanding that most of these conversations with an individual or an organization is going to be very specialized, very specific, and that we need to do our best to prepare. a lot of this is going to come down to listening. So when we talk about climate conversations, a lot of it's going to be listening. I know we won't always have the opportunity to have a code book right next to us where we're coding. These are communication behaviors, or these are the assumptions that I heard from your narrative. But these are things that we innately and want to begin to do instinctual as more of an instinct when talking about climate change. So a lot of next steps here, and I hope this was useful and applicable. I'm going to do on my next slide here is my contact information. As I mentioned, we only had an hour, but this is a topic that takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of iteration. So I want to thank everybody. I know we have some Q&As, but I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand it over to Cassie. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Josh. So I apologize, we are out of time for today. Josh, if you could put your email address in the chat box, and I know that there were some questions that we were not able to get to. We have another webinar coming up here, and so thank you for those who joined, and thanks, Josh, for making this interactive with the mentee. And these are difficult but important conversations to have, and we appreciate your perspective on these issues. And to our viewers, thank you so much. We'll be sure to reach out about future talks as well. As a reminder, we do have these sessions until bi-weekly until May this year. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Josh, as always, for taking the time to do this. We hope to see you again at a future session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Appreciate
everyone.
it.
Bye-bye.